everyone, I'm Dee Adair, State Manager here at REA. Welcome to our final episode of our exclusive three-part series, Customers Need Transparency. Today, as always, I'd like to welcome my co-host, Greg Braun, our Senior Market Research Manager at REA. Hi, Greg, welcome.
Dee, great to see you. And it's good to be back for this final episode. Hello, everyone. If you've tuned into our past two episodes, you'll know we spoke about buyers and sellers. And you'll also know that the aim of this series is to shed light really on the need for transparency when dealing with these key customer groups, buyers, sellers, and renters. We're wrapping up this final series today with our final episode, which does talk specifically on renters. Similarly to the others, we'll be looking at the information needs for our renters, the tools they utilize to gather information, the impact of COVID and what good that did for digital tools and the adoption there. So we're thinking virtual inspections, and then just exploring some commonly experienced frustrations, all neatly wrapped into a session on transparency.
Okay, well, let's kick off. And the first question I've asked you about both buyers and sellers, I'll ask you about renters as well. What are we seeing with renters and their need for transparency?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it should be really discussed amongst all of these groups, kind of separately and together, because typically they are all the same, or they're going to be at some point in their property lives. I would argue. But we kind of need to step back a bit, maybe 10 or 20 years, and think about how the consumer's really changed over that time. And I think it won't be a surprise for most people to hear that it's significant. These changes are big. The way we think, feel, and do in our kind of consumer lives has really changed. And this is a kind of a global movement. This is not something that's unique to Australia, nor do we have to look at it as something that Australia is almost removed from. It is something that's happened to all of us. There's some great studies around, some of the big four consultancies that talk about, the expectation gap. So what do consumers in Australia expect, and what are they actually getting? And this is in terms of customer service and customer experience and all of those things. And what it really says is that that expectation gaps are really growing more than it ever has done, rather than closing. So Australia, if anything, is playing catch up, and we've got to kind of lift our game to match that. But we're not here to talk about other people's research. We're actually here to talk about our research from Property Seeker Survey, commissioned and studied just the end of last year, so super relevant. And what it really tells us, in a nutshell, amongst lots of other things, but something super relevant, that we're just all looking for more information to do property stuff than we ever have done. We're looking at more sources, we're spending more time on them because we want to become really informed. And just as a side note, this is even more heightened amongst, early or late Gen Ys, so the earlier, younger in age, and then the early Gen Zs as well that are kind of coming through at the moment.
Interesting to have that generational lens on things as well. So when we think about renters, what are they looking for?
Yeah, so all the things you might expect. I think it's kind of, as long as it is broad, most interesting tips and advice, how to get on that rental journey, what do they need to do, think about, consider, how they move, finding a rental property, being a tenant, what that actually involves, costs, budgeting, and even, up to knowing about the suburbs, so getting to the pointy end of it. What should I be paying? What do other people pay? Market influences, what's going to change? All of these things, unless you do it kind of repeatedly and often, it's kind of new to everyone. So they're looking at everything, and they're super, super hungry to absorb that information.
And are they online for this information, or are they a little bit like buyers and sellers and using lots of different channels and platforms?
Yeah, it's more the latter. So it's kind of going anywhere where they feel like there is a trusted source, and that will be often a mixture of those two things. Where it is offline, it's about speaking to agents. It's about getting some expert advice, perhaps as they're in the research stage and not ready to commit yet. Reading agent collateral, friends and family. That's the biggest influencer for a lot of us. So like word of mouth piece and what our friends and family is saying about who we should speak to, what agencies we should rent from, or where, or how much we should be paying. Everyone seems to have an opinion, right? But we do know that renters probably spend more time online than buyers and sellers. I suspect it's there's a couple of reasons for that, but we've also seen, I think, what's really interesting more recently, and I don't think it's an overhang from COVID, or it's certainly here to stay, is this idea that digital inspections are really helping renters provide them greater clarity, therefore transparency on the journey that they're about to go on. We'll talk about that a bit more later.
Right. Are they happy with the information they've got access to at the moment as a group?
Yeah, in short, it's patchy. And I think that's one of the common themes across this series that we've seen when we're looking at buyers, sellers and renters individually and how they respond to our survey questions is actually, that is one of the common threads, is that the information out there is not always giving them what they want. It's there's a lot of black, there's a lot of white, and there's also a lot of grey. So and I think it's the grey that we need to and try and illuminate somewhat.
What's at the heart of these frustrations? What information is missing for renters?
The big one actually is, and the big kind of disappointment factor for a lot of our renters out there is actually just finding out that property is no longer available. So that it's it's advertised as one thing, but when they come to get a bit more serious about it, they can't actually proceed with that rental. It's funny, it's one of the this is true for other areas as well, but it's one of the biggest decisions we make in our lives. Even renting, living is our fundamental need of us people. So when we can't have all of that information, or where we get so acutely disappointed by something, it is a trust issue, and it's definitely a transparency issue. The funny thing is, I think that wouldn't really happen in e-commerce. You wouldn't go on to, say, Amazon, put a whole bunch of things in your shopping cart, about to pay, only to find out that that thing isn't available anymore. Yes, it might not be available, but at least early in the transaction, because it tells you, so you don't get further down the line. So we wouldn't put up with it in e-commerce. We seem to be putting up with it in other parts of our lives, which I think is an interesting idea, and perhaps one for another podcast.
Really interesting.
The problem with all of this is, I suppose, is that it does actually have, a negative impact on businesses. What that comes with is kind of a sort of a negativity towards the not necessarily the listing, but the listing agent. And I think that's really quite an important point to remember. If you have a negative experience like that, it already starts putting you on the back foot, or the wrong foot. And when you see that agent listing another property that you may be interested in, I think that's where it can all come a bit unstuck. The sort of lack of transparency at the top end actually becomes an issue when they're next trying to do something. And what they tell us in our surveys, that they're actually more likely, by some significant way, to skip over you, or to skip over that listing that you as an agent have attached yourself to, because of that previous experience that they had with you that wasn't great. So the knock-on effects can be brand damage. What's interesting here, though, is that you might never know when, as an agent, you might never actually know when that's happened, because why would you? Because this is all going on behind the scenes. So you're not actually aware of it. So you might not think it's a bigger issue as it actually is. But I can pretty much guarantee that it's going on. So what do we do to try and stop that? Just quickly, there's our survey also said just a couple of other areas where renters want things kind of fixed or improved. This is another really common area, less so in the rental space, certainly in the buyer space, but no price being provided is a key frustration. A written description of the property not actually being detailed enough, and leaving a lot of questions unanswered, or actually kind of causing more questions than it's answering, which is probably the worst of both worlds. And no address being provided, or price range being inaccurate or too broad. So all of these things create a situation where I have to then ask the agent, property manager for that information. And it's somewhat of a frustration because it's things that I already expect to be there. And yet I have to now go out of my way to ask for, hygiene information.
Yeah, those things can definitely be very frustrating. Property managers play a really important role in all of this, in this process. Where do they fit in?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely crucial. There is no question about that. And their job is, is a very, tricky one, given the numbers of, people that they have to deal with. But I think if property managers have done their jobs well, the renter will automatically be in a good position to take the next step. And I feel like, full and complete information where possible is a mantra that's worth adopting, because it is something that, will ultimately provide that transparency for the renter and set them up for, to put them in a good place when they want to progress. If not, as I've said, renters will start asking questions. And it's an admin burden, right? Let's be honest. But they're asking questions of things that they think they probably really should be there, these hygiene questions. But it's not there. And so to move with this kind of incomplete information or set of information that I'm comfortable with, moving on with that as a renter could actually just lead to more frustration, inability to make good decisions, and ultimately this is again a trust and transparency issue here.
So just on that, gaining trust and transparency, what does the research tell us in terms of whether or not we've seen an improvement in this area?
There's been improvements in some areas. So we see that the numbers jump around a little bit on things like price being provided, but ultimately trending down in the sense that it's becoming less of an issue over time, slowly. We don't see that so much with buyers. They still have that as their number one, and it's a pretty it's pretty big number consistently year on year. But I think what we are seeing is some areas that, well, maybe unintended consequences is possibly a better way of looking at it, where something like the pandemic actually brought around kind of a behavior, not behavior change, but certainly a fast tracking of a behavior that was already inherent in us and something that we're already adopting anyway. And that's really around digital inspections. It's formed a large part of the consumer journey across all types, not just renters, but certainly renters as well in the last year. But it's continued, and I think that's the really important part. People have become very accustomed and very used to this kind of technology, and it's something that really is now shining a light on a pain point that was very much sort of embedded in the journey prior to this. So that's a great example where an innovation, a technology, has created transparency around a set of conditions that was previously a pain point.
And why are things like digital inspections useful when it comes to transparency for renters? Yeah,
so probably the best way I can explain it, or the way I like to think about it, is if a picture tells 1,000 words, think about what a video can do. And I think that's really the sentiment behind it, where you have a series of perhaps curated images of a room or a property that tells a particular story. I think a video just kind of gets around the corners and gets into the cupboards and gets into all the places that you might want to do if you were there physically inspecting. But this saves you the bother of actually having to leave your home. Now, it's not to say it's going to replace a physical inspection. That is the gold standard of, and actually what most people would want to do. But what it does do is essentially stop time wasting. It provides a real, a clear light and removes a real sense of transparency about what that property is and what it isn't. And I think that's why it's been so successful and kickstarted, or perhaps injected with a bit more gusto in the last 12 months. We have asked some questions around this specifically because obviously it becomes such an important part of doing business in the last 12 months. But people are more likely to shortlist a listing because of this. So they have more confidence in themselves and the property itself. 80%, in fact, more likely to confidently shortlist this property. 22% are going to, make it an in-person inspection, or more likely to because of it. It reduces time wasting, and it actually has some really positive brand benefits on both the agent and the agency. People think the premium is more the listing is more premium, and they think that the listing is more complete. So all of these things that we see as sort of transparency issues have somewhat been alleviated from this.
That's brilliant. So for all the property managers listening today, what 3 pieces of advice would you give them, particularly around this issue of transparency?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to a couple of things. The first one that should be pretty evident, and it's probably easy for me to sit here and say, and hard to do, but it's really about giving all the information up front. I think that is where we are as consumers. We expect to get everything at a touch of a button, and we don't really want to have to work for information that we already think should be there. Some basic stuff to make a decision to make that purchase. This will do a couple of things. One, it will stop all the admin, all the requests for information. So actually a quality consumer should come forward when they are getting in touch. But it's really about the overall impact on kind of trust that they will have in you, and transparency ultimately in the process they're about to go on. And the other one I think is probably like leveraging the tech. That's really a clear message that's come from the research, that something like digital inspections has been so successful in creating a transparency around something that arguably was somewhat hidden, and that kind of lot of grey around that I spoke about earlier. It can have a huge amount of benefit in terms of that transparency for the rentee, and ultimately a better experience for all. So I think that's where we've landed with this. Love to talk more, but I know our time is up.
Look, it's absolutely fascinating, Greg, and we could sit here for a long time talking about all of this. Thank you so much for sharing your insights once again. I think our listeners can definitely agree that you've provided some really great key insights from the research that they can take away into their businesses. And if you do want to access this information, there's a downloadable PDF that's available on the Agent Marketing Centre that unpacks this data even further. So I encourage you to jump onto the Agent Marketing Centre today. So this brings us to the end of our series, Customers Need Transparency. I really hope this episode and the series as a whole has shed some light on the importance of transparency and the role it plays in alleviating frustrations for both buyers, sellers, and then also renters alike. We will be releasing more content over the coming weeks, including some really great key insights from the 2020 Property Seeker Survey that Greg's been talking about. So stay tuned as that is made available very soon. But in the meantime, if you would like to know more about your key customers, head to the Agent Marketing Centre online and you can download more information. And thank you so much for listening and tuning in.